what are the, oh yeah, we're recording this too. What are the good things to look for in an HF radio, especially for a new ham? For those of you who don't know, Rob does very detailed testing and analysis of lots of rigs across the board and publishes some specs, but some people I think take those specs totally out of context with regard to what's best for a new ham. So Rob, that's my intro. We're thrilled to have you doing this for us, and we will record it and have it available as a YouTube later. But Rob, take it away, and we'll try to make this thing work.
Okay, very good. Well, appreciate the invitation, and I will have a PDF of the presentation that I'll send to your club if you wish to post that someplace. And I'm definitely open for questions. I mean, we're going to do question and answer tonight, but email questions are great after the fact. So we'll talk about transceiver performance, but really emphasizing, well, what should the new ham look for? But let me say first off, what's more important, your antenna or which rig you picked? And really the antenna is the key. And directivity, if you had a three-element tri-bander, that's a really big deal. So think about your antenna as part of the whole budget. The radio is not the whole budget, and you've got other expenses too. So let's get going. So what is the next step? If let's say you've got some techs that are going to be upgrading in general, or even there techs right now with no plans right away, well, you've got some HF privileges. There are some CW privileges on several of the HF bands, and sideband privilege on 10 meters, not the whole band, a couple hundred kilohertz, but a couple weekends ago was CQ Worldwide sideband, and 10 meters was wall to wall from 28.3 to 29 megahertz. So your little portion of the band there would have been filled full of stations. So if you're a tech, you can still really take advantage of the fact that the sunspots are improving. And we've got 4 or 5 years, they're going to have amazing propagation on the upper bands. But of course, if you can, I'm sure you guys got a VE session there and upgrade from tech to general. So what will the general class offer that you can't do right now? Well, of course, you'll have all the bands. Digital FT8 is very popular. I bet you could work all states, WAS, in a couple of months with FT8 and of course DX. And you can find some band open with FT8 24/7 and often many bands at the same time. And don't forget the work bands. The work bands were the newest ones. We got some years ago, well, quite a few years ago. 17 meters and 12 meters for FT8 are just very popular. And 30. So you probably, if you're a tech and you're into 2-meter repeaters, you've probably got one in your car or considering that. But now if you take the jump to put more emphasis on HF, you can work most all the bands. Matter of fact, I even work 160-meter mobile, which is kind of crazy. So here's me one day driving from my Denver QTH to the one in Weld County out in the country in the north part of Colorado. And another ham just snapped this picture of me and of course figured out my call from the license plate and sent me this picture. So there I was, unbeknownst to getting photographed. And enjoying at that point, I was talking on 75 meters. So, and if you can see in the picture, and I'll have a close-up in a moment, I've still got capabilities for 2-meter repeaters or 2-meter simplex and 70 centimeters, but I've got the HF option. So consider in fact, if maybe you've got an HOA, a homeowners association problem, and you're limited on what you can put up for an antenna. But I've got friends that they'll have a good mobile and they can operate, go find a quiet location and operate for a couple hours. So this gives you just another arrow in your quiver. So there's a closer up of the antenna system. You can see there's a tuner on the roof. That's an ICOM tuner. And I can put all sorts of different antennas on this homemade antenna mount, as you can see there in the close-up. And so like for field day, I know you guys do field day. I guess what, a couple K3s and a 7300. When I'm going to do field day as a fixed mobile, I'll use a 5-foot mast and an 8-foot whip to give me a 13-foot vertical mounted the same place that this other antenna is mounted. And I can hop from 40 meters clear up to 6 meters by just pushing a button and the tuner tunes in a few seconds. So there's just a lot of flexibility whether you're going to be traveling some or you want to run field day mobile, or just have an option if you've got an HOA problem. You can work a lot of DX and on mobile, believe it or not, and this will just be getting better and better. We're not at the sunspot peak yet. My friend in Alaska, I've worked him on all those 5 bands. The last sunspot peak would have been about, what, 9 years ago. And so it's just amazing what you can do with an antenna and 100 watts. I recommend you put the antenna in the middle of the roof. A lot of people don't, but I'm kind of a fanatic on that. Also, I get to work DX on 40 meters driving up at night. One time I was breaking into a guy that was working a lot of US stations, and I said, NC0B Mobile, and he said, "Are you really Mobile?" And I said, "Yes." And he says, "Well, I'm giving you a real S9 report." So that was kind of fun. What's the key there, of course, is a good mobile antenna. One of my friends who's in a condo, he's got an HOA problem. So he runs a coax out the window to his mobile antenna with the car parked in the driveway. So there's ways to skin a cat there. So let's talk about what we want to do to make HF the best for whatever rig you've got. I'm going to talk about something that's probably not discussed much, and that's how do you set your receiver up to operate properly on the different bands? Once you've got privileges from 160 through, 70 centimeters and 160 through 6 meters, it isn't just a given that you like run the preamp all the time, for instance. So this is something that we need to learn about. I'm going to start now an assumption that if you are going to get a brand new rig, we need to limit the price to something reasonable, particularly if you're a newer ham. You don't want to say, well, I got to spend $5,000 or $6,000. That's certainly not the case. So you've got the, I just put a cutoff there, the current Kenwood TS590 SG, that's $1,600. The ICOM 7300, of which ICOM has sold about 60,000 of them worldwide. It's probably the most popular rig that's ever been produced. And then there's some Yaesu rigs and the little ICOM 705, which is not a 100-watt rig, but I'm going to cover that because you've got parks on the air, summits on the air, and things like that. So my lab measurements are published on the web now. They used to be published in print. That doesn't exist anymore. And that can weed out the ones you probably don't want to consider. But we need on-air evaluation from your friends, people on the air, and some tests that I do. So I was talking about this fact that it's not always obvious to the new HF ham. Well, do I just turn the preamp on and leave it on? I had someone at Contest University, which is a whole day presentation before the Dayton Hamvention. And it's not just about contesting. So if you do go to the Dayton/Xenia Hamfest, consider going a day early. K3LR, Tim Duffy runs that. And they cover all sorts of things like tower safety and antennas and USB ports and how to make things work, logging programs. But for instance, with the newer type of direct sampling radios, which are different, they started about 9 years ago, but became very popular with the ICOM 7300 6.5 years ago. They're really different than the typical super het that we've had for 50 years. They've got different gain structures if you don't have the preamp on and you don't have the attenuator on. So you just have to realize whatever radio you're sitting down in front of, and maybe you sit down at field day with a K3, or maybe someone brings a Flex or a K4, they don't all operate the same way. So if you looked at the table there, noise floor, no preamp, you can see, look at the vast difference, over 20 dB on what amount of gain the radio has without the preamp on. So you just need to know the radio. Nothing wrong or right about any of them. They're just different, but they're so different that you really need to have a concept on that. Like the Flex, if you're in a quiet location working a weak signal on 20 meters, you probably want your preamp on. That would never be the case with the ICOM, but the ICOM is going to need the attenuator on to work at the best way at night, 180, 40, 160 meters, for instance. So I think the typical gain mistake that's made is, if in doubt, turn the preamp on, and that's not correct. If it helps on 10 meters and 15, fine, that's what it's there for. But it isn't like, well, if more is better. Well, that's not the case. This one person at Contest University said, well, my radio has 2 preamps. I just leave the second preamp on all the time. Well, that's crazy. And likewise, you might be not obvious. Why would you want an attenuator on? But that's because band noise is different from 10 meters to 160. And the receivers don't need that much gain on the lower bands. So this is something you just need to consider, those adjustments. Preamp on, attenuator on, they're a tool. You don't use them all the time on, and you don't use them all the time off. And you just have to get used to that. In the case of the little 7300, it's only got one attenuator, so you're probably going to use the RF gain because it's a 20 dB attenuator, perfect for 160, not perfect for 40 meters, for instance. So I want to mention band noise, the difference if you're new to HF. The difference in noise at night on 160 versus the noise during the day on 10 meters is over 30 dB. Well, every radio today works on 10 meters and now 6 meters. Every new radio has 6 meters. So they have to have enough gain and sensitivity and noise floor, for technical terms there, to work right on 10 and 6 meters, but therefore they've got way too much sensitivity on the lower bands. So you probably want to say, well, I don't want the S meter reading as 7 all the time. So I'm suggesting you play with your attenuation, because you would really like your AGC threshold to be a little bit above band noise. So every signal in between stations, the noise in between stations isn't as loud as every signal you're working. And that's something you kind of have to get used to. Well, this is some information from my website. I've tested about 150 radios, some of them receivers in the old days when it was a receiver and a separate transmitter. Now everything today is a transceiver. And this list is the top 23. Now there's nothing magical about the top 23, but I had to cut it off at some point. That happens to be the little ICOM 705 at 88 dB. But you can see 20 years ago, you couldn't buy a radio that had a laboratory rating for dynamic range, which means can you work weak stations when the band is full of 6 strong stations? And that's the ability of the radio to handle this wide range of signals. Well, my goodness, now look, it goes up to 110 in this list, down to 88. Right in the middle is like 101. You couldn't buy a radio with 101 dynamic range 20 years ago. It just didn't exist. So we've got phenomenal choices today, from a new 7300 at $1,150 until the yen and the dollar hadn't shifted as much as it has in the last year. You could get a 7300 for $999. And of course, we've got ones that the sky is the limit. So this is the ones that I would say, if you picked anything on this list, you can have a great time working DX, rag shoes, contests, all the different modes. And I'd sort of start there. And of course, you have a PDF available if you want to look at the list in detail later. Almost all the current rigs, would probably say maybe all, have a band scope today and a waterfall. And that's something that was unheard of 40 years ago, but about approximately 30 years ago, the ICOM 781 had a band scope with a CRT. It wasn't LCD back then. It didn't have a waterfall, but you could see the signals on the band. Now this happens to be a screenshot of an ICOM 7610, but the screenshot of the waterfall and the band scope with the blips there, it's like a spectrum analyzer, would be very much the same. Just some of the other soft buttons wouldn't be there on the 7300. So what all do you see here? Let's say you're on 10 meters and there aren't that many stations, and you widen out the span to maybe 100 kilohertz, and you can say, oh, there's a station up the band that you never would have found. In this case, I was on 160 meters, and within this 10 kilohertz span, there were over 30 stations. So it's so handy, whether you're just looking for someone calling CQ, you're in a contest, or you're on sideband. Of course, you're going to have a different display, but you can see all these signals. And you can also see how good are the signals. I can't go into this much detail tonight, but look at the one on the left that says key clicks 5x, and then over on the right it says clean. Well, these are two CWS signals being set, probably sending CQ, and the one on the left is like 5 times wider than one on the right, and they're within a couple of dB of each other in signal strength. So the guy on the left has got terrible key clicks, the guy on the right does not. So what you see today on a waterfall and a band scope is reality. And you can see signals that look terrible and sound terrible and are splattering all over the place. So we just have amazing technology today with the all these band scopes that's just almost ubiquitous. As I was mentioning, on the lower bands, way too much sensitivity, in this case on the ICOM. So over on the left, you have an arrow, it says attenuation 12 dB. I've got like 30 dB of sensitivity to burn. So 12 dB or 15 dB, 18 dB even would be perfectly fine at night on 160. On 40 meters, maybe I run 6. 20 meters, none. On 10 meters, I probably be running a preamp part of the time. So you just have to know what band am I on, what's the band noise like, and what makes sense. So for the new ham, hopefully every new ham will stick with the hobby, but we know we all have had hobbies over time and some come and go. So that's why I'm suggesting you don't say, well, I'm going to just get my general and I'll go drop $5,000 on a rig. Probably not a great idea because you don't know what you're really going to be interested in the long run. So I was licensed 61 years ago. Well, back then it was a different world. Had a little Johnson Ranger national radio built the year I was born, 1947. But things are so much more sophisticated today, it's just amazing. So we need to sort of have a cutoff if you have a budget that would cover a rig and your antenna and like a tuner or something. Let's just say the whole budget was $2,000, but maybe you don't have $2,000. So you've got your Hamfest. I think you had a Hamfest last weekend. So that's where you want to start. Let your club members guide you on something that's maybe older and what makes sense. So what will you be interested in a year from now? You get your HF rig or just getting your feet wet? Well, maybe you spend all your time on HF, or maybe you still want to be on 2-meter repeaters or 70 centimeters. Do you want to work DX? Maybe you get into contesting. Sideband contesting is easy to get into. You're going to want a logging program to keep track, and that's really important. But you don't have to say, well, I haven't learned CW yet, I can't contest. You can contest on sideband virtually every week on some contest or other. Digital FT8, very popular. If you've, I've talked to guys that have said, well, I've got 10,000 FT8 contacts. Wow. I do a little bit of it. I also do some digital down below the broadcast band on 630 meters. So there's a lot of things you can do with this digital stuff. I'd suggest for the most part, if you're starting out on HF, get a 100-watt rig. I'm not saying you shouldn't consider a 5 or 10 watt rig, and I'm going to cover that in reference to the ICOM 705. But my brother-in-law bought 2 5-watt rigs when he first got his license, and I had trouble talking to him. I couldn't always hear him, even though he could hear me. I was running a 1.5 kilowatts with a Yagi at 70 feet. But when you're starting out, you don't want to get discouraged. So I'd say for the most part, go with a 100-watt rig and then put up the best antenna you can. If you had a trade-off between, do I buy a cheaper rig and more money for the antenna, I'd say consider that. Now, I don't know what you can put up in your case. Maybe it's a push-up mast. Maybe you've got a couple of trees. Maybe you've got one tree and do an inverted V, but your antenna is going to make or break you. Learn CW. It's not required anymore, but you can always get through on CW if other modes aren't working. And if you do have a limitation that you can only put a dipole in the attic, CW, digital FT8, things to really consider if you've got a compromised antenna situation. So your first rig, I'd consider pre-owned, picked up at your Hamfest. Of course, you've got things for sale on eBay. QTH.com. I've bought a lot of things on QTH.com. It's worked out fine. If it's your local ham fest and whenever the next one will come along and you got a couple of your club members there, they can really point you at this. Maybe not that one. Try to consider this one. The cost is going to be less. The TS590S, generally around $700. That was the best bang for the buck about 12 years ago. The TS590SG replaced it, so it's a little more expensive. Not enough difference to worry about. Whichever one is available and looks like it's in good shape, I wouldn't worry about whether it's an S or an SG. It doesn't have a band scope now because it goes back before the band scope became ubiquitous. The ICOM 746 Pro, 160 through 2 meters. So if you say, well, I've just got a 2 meter rig now, I could have an HF rig that covers 2 meters also. It's only about $600. Hamfest probably would be preferable because at least you can get hands-on. Hopefully it's plugged in, you can see if it works. I do suggest, even though there are some very fine computer-controlled rigs from Flex and Apache, for instance, start out with a standalone rig. You plug in the power supply, the antenna, and their microphone, you're on the air. Computers do amazing things, but sometimes they're a bit fiddly. So I'd say start out with a standalone rig. Keep it simple. If your budget is tight, whatever you can afford, get on the air with that. I used a Drake TR4 or a TR4C in the 70s, 1970s. You can probably buy one for $300. Maybe you need some help from your club to tune it up because it's got tubes in it. Probably hasn't been touched for 40 years or something. But you do what you can do and get on the air. Your local Elmers, that's just a term meaning your local hams that helpful to the young hams. Or if you're an older ham that's just got his license and you're 60 years old, get help from your friends. There are other costs, and you say, okay, you bought your rig. We don't want to blow the whole budget. You're going to need an antenna and a feed line. 100 feet of RG213, which is the larger coax with connectors already made on each end, which is probably a good way to start. About $150. But if you're running 100 watts, you don't need coax that big. You're not giving up that much in signal loss. So RG8X would be smaller, and it's about $100 with the connectors on it. Of course, you can put your connectors on a cable, but it might be good to start if you've never soldered a connector, maybe you get it already connected. A G5RV is an interesting off-center fed dipole. There are longer ones and shorter ones. So if you're not going to build your first antenna, that's a possibility. It's a little more expensive than if you build it. You probably need a balance, so DX Engineering makes them. End-fed half waves, a lot of controversy on that. I have some friends that really like their end-fed half wave. It may radiate from the coax somewhat, but if you've just got one tree and you want to have one end right near your house and one end up in the tree, it's something to consider. They work, but they're not perfect. You're going to need a power supply. Hopefully you can pick a used one up, but a 20 amp supply will run about 99% of the rigs. I think I had an Orion 1 that drew 23 amps, but that was the anomaly. I happen to currently use 35 amp power supplies, but usually you're drawing about 17 amps. So don't worry about blowing the budget on a great big power supply. A 20 amp supply will probably do just fine. Antenna comments. Well, my friend Rick, DJ0IP, if you do a Google search on him, he has phenomenal amount of information on the web. He republishes some of my stuff. He's got information on tuners, you name it. Anyway, he says height is might, meaning the height of your antenna is very important. The difference between an antenna at 25 feet versus 40 feet is just amazing. A homemade dipole, of course, shouldn't cost much to do that. If you've got your 100 feet of coax, it's $100. You've got about $10 in wire, and you can make a dipole. I'd considering the sunspots are improving every year and will for the next 2 or 3 years. Maybe make a fan dipole. That means a 20 meter dipole and a 15 meter dipole with this common feed line. So you can work those two bands. It doesn't take much space and it's very inexpensive. Sunspots are just improving. 15 meters has more spectrum and less QRM than 20. And there's FT8 goes crazy on 15 meters almost every day. I do suggest a horizontal antenna, so a horizontal dipole, a horizontal fan dipole, or another one that's come up again in a moment. The horizontal will give you ground gain. Well, what's that mean? If it's horizontal and the signal bounces off the ground and comes back up, you're going to get a lobe at a certain takeoff angle that gives you a 6 dB more signal than if the ground gain wasn't there, like you just had the antenna out in space. So from the standpoint of a vertical versus a horizontal, if you can get it horizontal, you're better off. Inverted V is okay. Totally horizontal flat top is a little bit better, but you do what you can do. One thing that I didn't realize until I built my station out in the country, and you'll see a picture of it in a bit, was how much noise comes out of the typical house. We've got all these electronic things. The dishwasher's probably got a microprocessor in it, your washing machine, your dryer, and of course we're charging your iPhone or whatever. So there's a lot of noise that's in your house. So if you can get your antenna further away from your house, the better. Now you have to consider your neighbor's house. So you probably want to put your antenna, if possible, furthest from any building. In my case, I've got towers far away from the house and close to the house, and it's just annoying that the ones closer to the house pick up more noise from things in my house. So that's just called RFI, radio interference. And it didn't happen in the 1970s and 60s. This wasn't an issue, but it is today. Another antenna to consider is what's called a ZEP. It would be center fed. So if you have a 40-foot wire cut right in the middle and you've got a feed line, this would be parallel feed line, like 300 ohm twin lead, 400 ohm ladder line instead of coax, and then a balun, and then a tuner balun. We'll try again here. So you want to have to go from the parallel feed line, which can be twin lead, ladder line, or open wire line. You need something called a tuner balun that'll go from balanced to unbalanced. And then you need some sort of a tuner. But if you have a 40-foot center fed ZEP, it will work on 20, 17, 15, 12, and 10 meters. And the main point of this is you know where the signal is going to go. If your wire ran north-south, the maximum radiation or maximum reception would be broadside. In other words, east-west. Here in Colorado, probably want it east-west. Maybe down in Georgia, you want to rotate it if you can with your supports, whatever your supports are, maybe point it a bit more to the northeast. So you really want to know where the signal is going to go, and particularly with the upper bands, you'd like it not going off to some direction. There's not that many stations. So it's more flexible than the 15 meter and 20 meter fan dipole, which is about as simple as you can get for 2 bands. So what's the trade-off? Well, it's more complicated, but you get 5 bands out of it. And of course, if you have a longer antenna, you can get more bands out of it. But then you don't know where the signal is going to go because it'll break into lobes. So here was a field day setup at my QTH in my backyard for a couple of years. I had the 40-foot center fed ZEP. I used open wire line, but the ladder line is fine. I happen to have a balanced tuner in the garage, but your tuner balun plus your unbalanced tuner works just fine. Well, there's the 7300 that 60,000 other hams have. You can hardly get onto the air today and somebody doesn't say I've got a 7300. It was a great field day rig for me. Of course, I was just me in my backyard. So here's what my setup looked like. I had a sort of a tent. It's hard to see, but if you can look right straight up from that white piece of tubing sticking up, there's the feed line going up to about 50 feet. It happened to be open wire line, but it could have been the window ladder line like in the picture. I also have a 170-foot center fed ZEP that I use on 80 and 40. So it's directional east-west, works really well to the Australia, really well to South Africa. And of course I use it on stateside too. So again, in this case, you'll need to deal with the fact that it's a balanced antenna and not coax fed. But the nice thing about either this ladder line, like on the right, or the open wire line, SWR really doesn't matter. You don't have to like say, well, I have to shorten the antenna 6 inches or lengthen it 6 inches. The tuner handles the match. The loss is minimal. So you don't even care what the SWR is on the feed line. You just want to tune it for 1-to-1 in the shack, in this case, out in the field. So there's my QTH out in the country. I don't expect you to do this, but here's where do you put your money in the antenna, whatever extent you can do so. If you look at the tower that's closest in this picture, there's a 3-element 17-meter Yagi, but that could be a tri-bander. A 3-element tri-bander at 40 feet is amazing. Of course, 50 or 60 or 70 feet's better. In this case, the antenna above the 3-element 17-meter is a 5-element 10-meter. Oh, is it fun on 10 meters with 5 elements to 65 feet? So let's comment on some of these radios that new or affordable. The 7300 came out 6.5 years ago. It was a game changer in that it was the first time you could get sort of the term SDR radio, but it was standalone with knobs. It didn't need a computer. It wasn't expensive, and it did really well. I mean, really, you can't get on the air for a weekend and not talk to another 7300. So it handled strong signals and weak signals fine. It operates very much like the more expensive 7610 that I'm currently using. I think the ergonomics, the interface between you and the radio are really good. The display works. It's not very big. It doesn't have an output for a bigger monitor. Some people really like a big monitor. I have nothing against that, but I've never done it. I wear bifocals. I don't need a big monitor, and the little monitor on the 7300 works just fine for me. The one nice thing about the ICOMs, they all work the same way. Now, of course, the one that's for VHF is going to have other features, but the user interface is consistent. If you can run a 7300, you can run a 7610. 9700 is a VHF UHF radio. It works the same size, the same way. It's about the same size as the 7300. And then there's the little 705 that I'll talk about later. They're just almost like peas in a pod for basic operation. And they came out with a new feature that made the waterfall work much better. So they add features, and if there's a bug, they fix the bug. So I've operated the 7300 for 6.5 years in contests. 160 contests like the picture I showed you a while ago. Lots of stations, lots of QRM. Just sit there and like take an hour and a half to go from 1.8 megahertz to 1.86 and just pick them off one at a time. The other extreme, an ARRL contest in December. There's a 10-meter contest that's CW and sideband, or you can just work one mode if you want. It worked just great for that. And then a couple years after that, I said, well, I better try it out on 20 and 15 during CQ Worldwide sideband or ARRL DX sideband. So I used a little $1,000 radio on 20 meters and 15 meters, and it worked. So you just can't go wrong with any of those lists of 5 radios that are, under $1,600. What's this Yaesu 710? Yaesu had never had a direct sampling radio until about 6 weeks ago. So that's the newer technology. Now, there's nothing wrong with a superhet. Superhet in some environments will have an advantage, but this was really a game changer for Yaesu. Works very much like the 7300. Since it came out 6.5 years later, some of the lab numbers are better. Is priced a little more expensive than the 7300. It's a little bit cheaper than the FTDX10, which is the sort of little brother of the FTDX 101. So all these radios are on my website, and you can look at them in that table. So I'll be evaluating the 710 as soon as the logging program supports it, maybe in time for sweepstakes. That'll be in about 2 weeks. That's a sideband contest in 2 weeks. But if not, there'll be the two contests in December, the ARRL 160 CW and the ARRL 10-meter sideband and CW. Last year, I evaluated the Elecraft K4. So this year, hopefully I'll be using the 710 in 2 or 3 contests. I happen to prefer the ergonomics, in other words, the user interface of the ICOM, but you get used to whatever the interface is. So that's just personal choice. Someone else could have the opposite feeling. So I want to comment on the FTDX10. A year and a half ago, I ran it in a 160 meter CW contest, the CQ Worldwide 160 in January. It has excellent lab numbers. The ergonomics, once you get it set up, you don't have to do much after that. It's a classic hybrid superhet. In other words, it has a roofing filter and it's a superhet. If you don't have someone 10 blocks away or something, probably no difference between a direct sampling and the superhet. But your K3s, for instance, at field day will have an advantage over the 7300, particularly if you're on the same band or if you don't have bandpass filters. Hopefully your setup for field day would have bandpass filters. So if you're on 3 stations at once on different bands, you're not going to bother each other. And then once you're into CW, the 2 new Yaesu rigs that are under that $1,600 price range, they've got what's called an audio peak filter that augments the selectivity that's in digital mode today. So nice feature. Doesn't exist in the 7300. So contest that I operated there with the FTDX10 was the 160. I only had about 6 hours that weekend to operate. I worked over 200 stations, 3 from Japan. Japan is kind of, if I don't work Japan on 160 in a contest, I'm upset. So I worked 3 of them with this radio that cost about $1,500. The selectivity, it's all digital now, works great. The audio peak filter works great. The band scope, kind of jumpy, but if you set the sensitivity of the band scope and the waterfall, you can kind of make that minimal. I really like a mouse with the FTDX10 because it has a lot of buttons around the main tuning knob, and it's kind of easy to push these tiny little buttons and bump the tuning knob. So I found the mouse was a big improvement, but that's up to you. If you have a logging computer too, which I'm sure you're going to want to do if you're in a contest, well then you end up with 2 mice, but that's about the only problem. It does have kind of noisy relays for transmit receive, and the tuner's kind of slow and kind of noisy, but in 20 seconds it's tuned, end of the noise. The TS590, as I mentioned earlier, this was the best bang for the buck until the 7300 came along, but it goes way back. The SG 2014, the S 2010. So that was before band scopes were common. And the used market, I would have no qualms say, you find a TS590S for $600 or something, go for it. It's got a good user interface. I've run contests with both the S and the SG. N2IC, Steve London used to just have 2 590s. He's now got a 101D from Yaesu and a 590 still. So you don't ever get the idea that you have to have a $5,000 or $6,000 or $7,000 radio to really be competitive if that's what you're into, because Steve London is really competitive, good antennas, great operator, and modest price radios. So I'm going to cover something that's not going to be your 100-watt rig, probably for most of the time. Summits on the air, parks on the air. I had to look up to see if you had summits in Georgia because I wasn't sure, but you do. So you've got some mountains up there with repeaters and all that. So that's a lot of fun to go up a mountain. Now you're not going to want to take a 40-pound radio up a mountain. So this little ICOM 705 doesn't weigh much. If you like operating outdoors, then probably easier to do in Georgia than it is in North Dakota, for instance. So this little 705 covers 160 meters through 6 meters, like all the other rigs today, plus 2 meters and plus 70 centimeters. All modes, sideband, CW, FM, repeaters, Digital with a laptop, $1,350. It does have a companion external tuner if that's what you're into. It's a little expensive, but you saw that mobile setup of mine that had that tuner on the roof. It's really the same type of design. It runs on batteries and it has latching relays and it works really well. For instance, they'll say if you had a 23-foot wire that you sort of threw up into a tree, hooked up their little tuner, and you want a radio, you want some sort of a ground. So say you run a radio out to the other direction, you can go from 40 meters to 6 meters to the touch of a button. So, and consider parks on the air. I mean, obviously we got national parks and state parks. What if you just got a local park? I've got a park that's 2 blocks from my house here in Denver. I can go out there with a 705, a 10-pound battery, set it on a picnic, throw a wire up into a tree and have fun spring, summer, fall. So your parks on the air can be anything and just have fun. There's what the little 705 looks like. It weighs less than 2.5 pounds. It runs exactly the same way as a 7300 that your club uses for field day, and it even covers more bands. So it's just quite amazing little radio, but it is 10 watts with an external battery, 5 watts with the internal battery. So I've operated contests with this. Really the ergonomics, if you can run a 7300, you can run a 705. So what did I do with this about 2 years ago? I wasn't running QRP. In other words, I wasn't running it at 5 or 10 watts. I did drive an amplifier, but I was really evaluating how is the receiver in this tiny little radio. It's about the size of a brick. So I operated sweepstakes. I just worked the first 100 stations. That was on sideband and had fun. So, okay, it works like great that way. The next 2 weeks later was the ARRL 160 meter CW contest. I worked almost 400 stations. I worked 2 from Japan with this radio the size of a brick that weighs 2.4 pounds. I worked 80 sections, which would mean the ARRL sections in the Canadian provinces. I was on the air for 16 hours with this little tiny radio. Then the next weekend, I worked 10 meters, CW sideband, used the little hand mic. So quite a little radio. So I'd heard someone saying before that we started about you don't want to just pick a radio like with one number. I mean, my chart that you saw was sorted by one factor, the dynamic range, which means how does it handle working a really weak station with a band full of strong stations. But you don't buy a race car that can go 100 miles an hour, but if you go around the curve, you're in a ditch. So you don't buy a radio for one number only. Look at the big picture. What features does it have? For instance, you want the audio to be clean and the AGC to work well. If the ergonomics, the human interface, is confusing, well, that's a problem. Does the speech processor work if you're on sideband? That's important. It gives you about 6 dB more talk power. A lot of us live in the city. Noise blanking and noise reduction are important in the urban environment. They're quite a difference in how the radios work in that respect. Everything today I consider a software-defined radio. I know the term's more used that, well, the software-defined radio is run with a computer, like a Flex or an Apache, for instance, or some of the Flexes have a built-in screen. But is the firmware updated? Every radio is full of programming today, whether it's the little 7300 or radios that do require the computer. So I like the term it's either a direct sampling radio or it's a super het, and I don't really use the term SDR. What's warranty service like? The radios today have components the size of a grain of sand. I don't know how you can even see it. I know I got bifocals. I have to have a magnifying glass to see these little tiny components. So you need some service from the factory on time. Used to be Kenwood had a terrible trouble. They have a new company now in New York that does well. But when the one in California would sit on your radio for 3 or 4 months, that was just ridiculous. So service is important. Is your radio supported with parts, particularly if you bought a used radio that maybe is not in production anymore? Can you get it fixed? You need to know that. And then the bottom line, do you have fun running your radio? I've had people say, well, I know the one at the top of your list, but I don't like it. Well, then if you don't like it, get something else. It really is, this is a hobby. And so at the end of the day, whether you were rag chewing, running a contest, doing FT8, whatever it was, it should have been fun. And you said, boy, that was cool. So what works for you doesn't necessarily work for me, but whatever you've got, enjoy it. If you don't, get something else. There's my email address, rob@nc0b.com. Always answer my emails if anyone has a question or want a copy of the PDF, although your club will have it. And free for questions. I'm going to get out of screen sharing here now. And let's see if anybody has a question.
All right.
We can start here.
Yep.
Start here in the room and see if any of our folks locally have questions, and then we'll questions.
I have one. All right. We can go around. Go ahead and start back. We'll come
I
back.
wonder if Rob had a personal favorite that he liked the most.
Just a minute. I think the question is, Rob, do you have a personal favorite radio that you like the most? Is that correct?
Okay. Well, currently I have 3 ICOM 7610s because I have 3 operating positions. This has double usage. If a new radio comes out, like this new ICOM, like the new Yaesu FT710, I'll tear down one of the operating positions and put the new radio there. When I was comparing a 10-tech Eagle and a FTD and a TS 590S one contest, I had my reference ICOM, which at that point was an ICOM 781. I had the Kenwood and I had the 10-tech, and I would just change chairs and compare the two. But what I do for a contest, for instance, is if it's an all-band contest like CQ Worldwide or ARRLDX, I'll have one position on 10 meters, one on 15, and one on 20 during the day. And at night, I have one on 40, one on 80, and 160. So it's kind of crazy. I don't expect you to do that. But so I've got 3 7610s. I've had the Kenwoods. I've had every radio on that list of 23. I've run 17 of them in a contest. So that's just what works for me. But all those radios will work fine. They're just going to be different.
Thank you.
Any other questions here locally? Craig, hold on. I'll give Craig the mic.
I'll just walk over here next to the computer. So you mentioned in one of your slides the IP plus function in the 7300, and I found when doing some research conflicting information. Could you share a little bit about how you utilize the IP plus function on the 7300s?
Sure. Well, all the ICOMs have a, well, the 7300, the 7610, and the 9700 have a quote IP plus button. Do I use it? No. It makes a big difference in the laboratory. It linearizes the ADC chip, the analog to digital chip. It makes it more linear. So when you're in the laboratory, it's obvious whether it's on or off. I've so far have not heard a difference on the air turning it on and off on the low bands, because any type of distortion in an ADC chip, it's pretty weak. And with band noise, let's say on 80 meters or 40 meters, let alone 160, any kind of distortion in the ADC chip would be below band noise. So you'd never hear it. I asked Adam Farson, who also tests radios. He said he listened to a CW contest on 40 meters, and he thought he could tell the difference. It was a little bit cleaner sounding when he was comparing on and off for the IP plus. It's kind of a silly name because IP stands for intercept point. It has nothing to do with intercept point. It has to do with linearizing the ADC chip. In the case of the 9700, it does nothing. The 705, it doesn't have that feature. Here's my theory. We'll find this out over the next 2 or 3 years. Let's say we have a major contest where we've got wall-to-wall CW signals on 10 meters. I mean, hundreds, maybe thousands. I would expect that on 10 meters, since the band noise is so much lower, that we'll hear these interference, this distortion products kind of this funny little blips. I mean, when you're tuning around a CW contest, if you tune between stations, if you're hearing little beep, 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 beeps, crazy things that make no sense, that would be the type of distortion that the IP Plus would linearize or probably eliminate. And I think that we're going to notice that on 15 meters and 10 meters in the coming 2 or 3 years would be my guess. There's only a slight degradation of your noise floor, like 1 dB with a 7300, like 3 dB with a 7610, with an Apache like 1 dB or less. So it has the, and with the K4, I think they say maybe 1.5 dB. It's almost immeasurable, but it's something that's good. It's there. But there, I heard just in an email just recently, somebody said, I turned it on and it made the band scope more sensitive. Well, that didn't make any sense. So I don't believe that. That's crazy. So use it if you find it makes a difference, but I just keep mine off. We'll see what happens in the next couple of years on 10 meters.
Thank you. Other questions? Let me get the mic over.
I got one question about interference. I got one question on interference. I use an old ICOM 718, but with this, but he's switching power supply. And it's not unusual for you to hear a whistling sound. Is that coming from the switching power supply or the local power company? Back to you.
Well, explain what you're hearing, but it may most likely the switching power supply. And I think it mostly depends on where your antenna is. I have an Astron switching power supply, and I took it on a trip. I was in Texas and in Corpus Christi, and my brother-in-law brought his rig and his switching power supply, and we had a buddy pole 20 feet away, just through a window and like in the side yard. And we were definitely hearing birdies interference from the power supply. But then when I used that same power supply at the QTH you saw out in the country, the towers are, for the most part, 200, 300 feet away. I don't hear it at all. And if you had just a whip or something or other, if you were like out at a field day or something and had an antenna 5 feet away, I think that would be the kind of the worst case. So I don't think it's from the power company. And if your antenna is far enough away, it probably doesn't matter. Some of the switching power supplies have a knob to move the birdies around. Well, that would drive me nuts. That was interesting. So I happen to prefer the linear supplies, but you do what works for you, and just don't get your antenna too close to the power supply B. I would say you're better off 100 feet away than you are 20 feet away.
Okay, anybody else locally? Yeah, I don't know how many folks we have on Zoom, but I don't know how this will work out, but we'll see if we can entertain some questions, right, Craig?
I will. What I'll do is I'll ask if you have a question and you're on the Zoom, if you wouldn't mind visually just raising your hand. I see Craig raising his hand already and waving. And anybody else, if you're muted, if your video is off, we won't be able to see you do that. You'll need to use some type of a gesture, one of the keys down at the bottom of your screen. So Craig, if you'll unmute, go ahead, and we'll start with you, Craig.
Thanks. You spend a lot of time talking about ergonomics, and I guess one of the features maybe you didn't talk about was the ability for any of these rigs to be remote controlled, and how easy, hard, or impossible that is.
Okay, well, there's certainly differences. You know, some of them have in effect a built-in server. You know, the Flex really emphasizes that, but I rented access to my QTH for a year to W1MBB, who's in Florida, and he sent me up an ICOM 746 and an amplifier, and we had some what's called IP switches to turn the equipment on or off. Like you could reboot the computer, you could reboot the radio, you could turn on the amplifier, and he used remote desktop and I believe Skype for audio. So you can remote about anything, depending upon whether you want an integrated package that we just need an Ethernet connection to the radio. And then some, ICOM sells a software package. I've never used it. So I would say anybody's radio day can be remoted, but some are, that's a major focus. So how many people, I'd be interested in how many in your club do operate remote. It's one of the reasons today that remote is more popular than 50 years ago is there's so much noise in an urban environment. And if you've got access to a remote station, that's you assume is going to be in a quieter location.
Yeah, I don't, but I know several people that do.
And of course, there's a lot of web SDRs. So even if you're not going to be operating the transmitter remote, I know I have some schedules on Sunday, and we're spread out from Colorado, Eastern Slope, Western Slope, Ohio, New York. Sometimes the skip is really good on 20 meters or 40 meters for all four of us. Other times I'll be listening on a remote SDR. They call them a web SDR. And so you can just listen on another location that's in a quiet location too. So that's an option that anybody can use. You just have to find the one that works for you, and you bring it up on your computer.
All right. Next on the Zoom, anyone else?
We can't see everybody, can
We can,
we? Can?
and I'm also looking here. Anybody else give us a wave or a gesture?
Let's see what Jeff's on frequency here. Jeff of AGNM. I know you do some remote, or you're setting up for it. If you have anything you want to comment as far as remote goes.
Yeah, Rob. Well, I have a Flex 6600M as my primary radio, and I really haven't remoted it much until recently, but I've gotten into that big time recently because I'm going to be traveling at a time when the Beauvais de-expedition is going on, and I'd really like to get them in my log. So I may be trying to work Beauvais from the other side of the world. As you mentioned, most rigs can be remoted one way or the other using either TeamViewer or Tight VNC, one of these desktop applications that allows you to more or less be in front of your computer from a remote location. I've been experimenting with my Flex two different ways. I can go directly into the Flex radio from either an iPad or a computer without having a local computer running at all. Just connect to it through the Flex server. And that seems to work pretty well, but I'm not sure that it works as well for FT8 because I would be sending the FT8 tones through the internet. I have done that. I've worked people that way, but I think there's some degradation in the performance. So the other way to do it is to use a local computer to generate the tones and just control it via remote desktop interface. And I'd like to mention, these IP switches you mentioned, I just got into that recently. And there are some really nice power strips that have Ethernet connections to them and so forth, but they're fairly pricey. They're $100, $200, and there's some setup complexity sometimes to open up ports on your router and things like that. But I've been, and I know Ned's been using this too, I've been using these KASA, K-A-S-A devices. They're smart home devices, and they are smart plugs, and they're seamless. They're plug and play through the KASA server, and they're very inexpensive. So that's what I'm using to turn on and turn off various things. And actually today's project was to build up a 240 volt contactor in a box that I can control with one of those KASA plugs so that I can turn the power on and off to my linear amplifier. If I want to kill the power to it completely and reset it and bring it back up, I can do that. So anyway, I would recommend taking a look at these CASA plugs if you want to remotely turn on and turn off equipment.
And you certainly need to be able to reboot your computer. And you're a lot of the times with the computers that you can have a feature in BIOS that the computer will boot itself once the power comes back on, and that's really handy.
Rob,
Yeah, I'm just getting into that myself, but I'm going to use a CASA switch plug on the computer as well. And I'll have the BIOS boot the computer up. And I'll have to use a remote desktop application to do an orderly shutdown. But if the computer locks up, I can just turn off the CASA device and turn it back on, and the computer will reboot.
Right.
Rob, comment from here.
Yes.
We have at least 3 of our members that are using remote, Tom, W4TWK, Jeff, W4DD, I see both them, and Francis, K4JUG. I think they're all using Flex, and they are remoting them all with pretty good success. I think the learning curve was interesting for a while, but I think all 3 of them have worked remote and continue to work remote with the Flexes quite well.
And we use CASA devices.
That's right.
All right. Now, I hadn't heard of that device, and I did this remote from Matt W1MBB like several years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. And there was the things that were upgraded at my station at the time was you had to be able to control the rotors with a computer program as opposed to just turn a knob, and had to be able to, of course, bring the audio in and also select the antennas. Since on HF I've got 9 antennas, so we needed a major upgrade on antenna switching. So that's sort of it's you can start simple. What if you said, I'm just going to set it up to work 20 meters? You can probably keep it pretty simple, but as you get more flexible, your requirements go up.
Yeah, just to FYI, the CASA devices for single point on-off AC kind of things are under $10 each. You can order them in groups of 4, and they're like $25 or $30. So to turn the rig on and off and to push buttons and do simple things, very inexpensive.
Wow, that's a bargain.
Yeah, I have a question about CASA for Jeff or any of the other users, since I'm new to CASA. It seems like they work very well and they're easy to set up. I'm wondering about security. Is their server pretty secure? Anybody had any experience with that? Are they reliable and are they secure?
I definitely say they're reliable. I haven't looked into security since they're only controlling that remote device. I haven't been overly concerned about it, but they work extremely well. And in our case, for the Flex, you need something to power up the DC power supply. And then you need a second one, basically like you did with your 220 volt control. I have my second CASA that powers up a 12 volt wall wart, and that wall wart then closes a relay, which pushes the button effectively on the Flex. But pretty simple to do, and for $20, $25, you can have a remote operation and be able to turn it on off.
Yeah, I'll mention one other thing I discovered. There's a device that is only around $15 that does what you build up with a power supply and a relay, but it's basically 120 volt input, and it has a single pole double throw relay contacts on. I think it's made by NCI, and that's what I'm using. I'm using a CASA to control it and then turn the radio on. The other thing that I did recently, my daughter has been using these Wise cam pan internet cameras, video cameras, pan, tilt, and zoom. They're under $50, and she's been using them to watch her pets and things. But I bought one to have in the shack here, so I can actually see my radio and see what's going on in the shack as well, in case something goes haywire, and I get a little bit better idea of what's going on here when I'm remote.
So when the smoke starts coming out of something, you'll know it. Huh?
Yeah, I don't know if I can control a fire extinguisher with it.
I think we're drifting a little bit off topic here, so, any other questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Al.
Great presentation. Thank you, Ron. You mentioned 20 amp, say, linear power supply, and you were talking about a 100-watt rig. There's always been a lot of questions about that through the years. Should you run a 20 amp Astron linear on a 100-watt rig? Is that enough, or do you need to go to the 30 or 35? I think you said 20 was fine, but I just want to make sure I heard that correctly.
Right. Well, most of the rigs, their specs are like 17 or 18 amps. So the only rig that I found of all the ones I've run over 30 years was the Orion one that drew 23 amps. So obviously that wasn't adequate, but I ran 20 amps for at least 20 years and only went to the 35 amp Astrons because I wanted the metering. Now, of course, you can get the Astron 35 with or without metering, but I finally decided I want to know how much current something is pulling. The voltage accuracy isn't great. I mean, you can tell it's putting out around 13 or 14 or 15 volts, but I've seen no problem running 99% of the rigs on a 20 amp linear supply.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I got one.
Oh, there you go. Stand by.
Hey, thank you again, Rob, for the presentation. I wanted to ask you, when we saw the picture of your shack and the antenna farm there, very nice. It made me wonder kind of what your lightning protection that you employ there at your QTH. I was wondering if you could give us a brief synopsis of that real quick.
Okay, well, that's a good point. And here's one thing that I learned from John Brosnahan. Unfortunately, he's SK. When you do have a lot of aluminum in the air and a lot of tips on it, like in my case, well, there's like 15 Yagis if you consider everything, and wire antennas, you tend to dissipate the electric field to some extent. In 15 years, I've never had a direct hit. And I think with a direct hit, you probably do need to follow all those rules that in the ARRL book, you know, bonding and grounding and all that. I just have a ground stake, an 8-foot ground stake at the bottom, at the base of each of the 6 towers. And I have a lot of insurance. And I used to, the ARRL has a program. Now I'm still with the original company. They changed companies, and the least of several years ago, the new company, the ARRL insurance, would only cover like 1 or 2 towers. Well, I got 6, so that didn't work. So I stayed with the original. So I pay about $1.50 100 per year, and I've had 3 electromagnetic pulse events in 15 years. It wasn't a direct hit. One was pretty darn close, and I was at the QTH when that happened. It was like flash boom. So it probably was within a couple 100 feet. I don't know. I did over time eliminate long Ethernet runs. I have fiber optics in the house now because I had 600-foot Ethernet runs, and I actually had an EMP blow up a computer. I've had it blow up a DVR from Dish Network. So the electromagnetic pulse, from my standpoint, was the bigger issue. I mean, I think if you get a direct hit, it's kind of hard to really protect. Now, some people have a simple setup and they say they unscrew the antennas and throw them out the window or whatever. I know Steve London, N2IC, does that. With 3,000 feet of hardline and all these different Yagis and 6 rotators and all this, I can't disconnect stuff. So Word Silver has a good book on grounding and bonding, and so by the book, that's the way to do it. But I just cover it with insurance, and I figure I've only had 3 events, and the damage really was modest, like under $1,000. The biggest problem I had was a windstorm that wiped out my 40-meter Yagi. It was a windstorm for a day and a half, 70 miles an hour, and the little high gain 402 VA just fell apart. So that was covered by my insurance, and I now have a JK 40-meter Yagi. So I guess that you've got two options. You can either do what Ward says, or you can cover it with insurance, and that's what I do.
Any other questions? I don't see anybody else, so I guess we'll wrap it up. We have our business session here locally to do, but Rob, I can't thank you enough for doing this for us. It's been great, and I hope we all learned some things. And you know, there's nothing like the experience you have to guide some of our newer folks as they get into the hobby, and especially start playing around with HF. So thank you very much, Rob, and thank you on Zoom, everybody, for joining us. And what else can I say? We'll look forward to having this presentation on YouTube somewhere, and Rob is going to supply us with the PDFs of the presentation, so we'll be able to carry on. And I'm sure you may be getting some questions from individuals as time goes on. So thanks again, and I'm going to sign off, and we'll shut down Zoom, and except for the local members that are on Zoom, we'll terminate this event. Thanks again, Rob.
Okay, well, my pleasure, and I hope that your more and more your club enjoys HF, because it's going to be a good run for the next 5 years.
Thank you, Rob.
If you get back this way, you can join us at the brewery for field day.
All right. Well, hopefully I'll just work you on field day. That'd be good.
Okay.
Thanks,
All right.
Rob, and everybody. 7-3.
7-3.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and let you guys let yourselves out if you don't want to stay for the business meeting side. Thank you for joining us on Zoom, and 73 to everybody as you head on out. Thank you, Mr. Sherwood.
Bye-bye.